There are truths that quietly follow us for many years, and one of them is that a person can live an entire life without ever taking a single step that truly belongs to themselves. I never believed that until the day I realized that some mornings I woke up as if I had been placed in a room that was not mine, with walls built by someone else, doors chosen by someone else, and a path laid out long before I was old enough to know what I really wanted. That feeling is not loud, not fierce. It is as quiet as a thin layer of dust on an old wooden table. But the longer it stays, the harder it is to wipe away. It makes me wonder whether life is something we are living or something we are only trying to get right. I remember an autumn morning when the air was cold enough for my breath to turn into mist the moment it touched the sky. I looked into the bathroom mirror and saw a familiar face, but a distant gaze. It felt as if I was observing someone who had followed the standard script for too long, hardworking, polite, never causing trouble, always doing exactly what was expected. I once believed that this stability was a beautiful form of life, but then, under the warm yellow light above, I realized that stability could also be a pair of golden handcuffs, shiny and beautiful, but still handcuffs. When I was little, I was taught that to be loved, I had to be obedient. To be respected, I had to stay within the rules. To have a proper future, I had to walk the path that everyone else walked. Those words entered me as naturally as breathing, and I never questioned whether they were truly meant for me. As I grew older, I realized I was still chasing the shadows of approval. A proud smile from my parents, a nod of satisfaction from my teachers, or the quiet admiration of strangers. But in exchange, I lost the small things that once made my heart beat faster. I used to love writing, letting my thoughts flow across the page the way water spreads across a lake. But then it was pushed aside and replaced with things that were considered more promising. I once wanted to try a creative job, but I chose the safe path because I was afraid people would call me unrealistic. I once wanted to turn in a different direction at the last moment, but I could not, because the disappointed eyes of those I loved sometimes hurt more than 1,000 failures. That feeling of living without truly living is like walking a long road without knowing where you are heading. And the scariest part is that it does not make you collapse all at once. It slowly wears you down, making you numb, losing connection with what once mattered to you. You learn to stay silent when you want to speak, nod when you want to refuse, force a smile when inside there is only cold emptiness. All because of a single desire: do not disappoint anyone. One day, in a small cafe by the park, I saw a woman in her 30s sitting alone in front of a cold latte. The light fell onto the marble table while her gaze fell into the empty space ahead. It was as if something unspoken was growing heavier on her shoulders. I did not know who she was, but in that moment, I saw myself in her tired posture. We were people raised with maps drawn in advance, and then one day we realized that those maps did not just point out our direction, but also limited who we could become. I used to look at those who dared to turn off the main road, who dared to choose the path fewer people walked, with a mix of admiration and fear. Admiration because they lived true to themselves, fear because they reminded me of what I did not dare to do. Inside each person there is a small voice, fragile but honest, calling us back to who we are. But that voice is often drowned by the noise of expectations, the fear of judgment, and the comfort of what feels safe. It becomes very easy to forget that we once had dreams too. Someone once asked me why I did not live the way I wanted. I used to want to answer that I no longer knew what I wanted. But deeper down, the truth was that I was afraid. Afraid that if I chose wrong, I would be looked down on. Afraid that if I walked against the crowd, I would be left behind. Afraid that if I stopped to find myself, I would fall out of the race that everyone was trying so hard to run. And most of all, afraid of standing before the mirror and facing the truth that for so many years I had only been someone else's shadow. Yet fear has something interesting. It reveals what we truly long for. I realized that we only fear losing what matters to us, and I feared losing myself. Because deep inside, I knew I deserved more than a life decided on my behalf. In that moment, on an ordinary day, that thought appeared like a ray of sunlight breaking through thick clouds. It did not give me the answer, but it opened a small door. A door just wide enough for me to see another possibility. Maybe strength is not about walking away or changing your life overnight, but about facing the question you have avoided for so long. whether the life you are living is truly yours? This question does not need an immediate answer. It only needs to be acknowledged. Because the moment you dare to ask it, something inside you has already begun to long for a different way of living. And this is only the beginning. The beginning of a journey that is quiet but deep enough to change the way we see ourselves. With just a small opening of light, even the darkness can begin to tremble. There is something strange that happens when we begin to look directly at that truth. Everything that once felt familiar suddenly becomes a little more distant, as if what used to have clear colors is now covered by a thin layer of mist. I started to notice how I reacted to compliments, how my heart tightened whenever someone showed displeasure, and how I always tried to walk in a rhythm that was not mine. These things once felt normal to me, like breathing, but when I looked closer, they were like invisible strings tied to every movement, pulling me in a direction that did not truly belong to me. I remember standing at the dinner table with my family, everyone talking about what they believed was right, stable, certain. Those words repeated again and again, falling onto the table like small stones, creating ripples that only I could clearly feel. They spoke with genuine care, but that sincerity carried weight, making me feel like a boat being pulled toward a harbor I did not want to reach. I stayed silent, not because I agreed, but because after so many years of following along, I no longer knew how to speak the truth inside me. We often do not realize we are being guided by the expectations of others until we stand before a choice that everyone else thinks is reasonable, while our heart beats to a different rhythm. I once stood in that place, in a spotless white office, listening to people talk about opportunities, about salary, about a smooth career path. I nodded, but my eyes turned to the reflection in the glass window, seeing that the person standing there held no joy at all. When I left the building, the wind rushed down the long street, and I felt something inside me wanting to break free, but being held back by years of hesitation. Many people believe pressure comes from parents, from society, from rules passed down from earlier generations. That is true, but not complete. A part of that pressure also comes from ourselves, from the words we have heard for so long that they turn into our inner voice. That voice carries the tone of the ones who once taught us right and wrong, the ones who tried to teach us how to live without getting hurt. Sometimes that voice even takes the shape of fear. Fear of being isolated, fear of choosing the wrong path, fear of being seen as ungrateful, fear of being labeled different. And then one day, we realize we have gone too far from who we are. Not because of a big event, but through a very small moment. For me, that moment happened late one evening when I sat at an old wooden desk, opening a notebook I had written in during high school. The handwriting was messy and young, but filled with things I once dreamed of exploring. I read it and felt my heart tighten, not out of regret, but because I realized the person who wrote those words was still somewhere inside me, pushed into a dark corner for years by what others believed was appropriate. I closed the notebook, feeling as if I had just spoken with an old version of myself, a version I had forgotten. In the quiet of the room, I realized the struggle inside me was not between myself and others, but between myself and the many layers I had worn in order to be accepted. The irony is that we believe we choose those layers to survive, but the more we wear them, the harder it becomes to breathe. I began to notice the people around me. At the bus stop, in the cafe, at the supermarket, everywhere I saw faces carrying the tiredness of people trying to stay true to their role. A father trying to appear strong beside his son, a young woman in office clothes who looked as if she wanted to run somewhere else, a young man staring at his phone, as if searching for something his daily life could not offer him. I did not know their stories, but I knew that feeling. Seeing them was like looking at pieces of a mirror reflecting parts of myself. Somewhere within these unintentional images, I slowly understood that living by others' expectations is not anyone's single fault. It is passed from one person to another, like a shared habit, like a way for us to feel safe in a world full of uncertainty. We cling to agreement to avoid the fear of being left behind. We follow the crowd to avoid stepping wrong. We stay silent because we are afraid our true voice might hurt someone. But in doing so, we end up hurting the truest part of ourselves. Someone once told me that the safe path leads to a peaceful life. But peace is not the silence of the heart. Peace is when we can breathe deeply without feeling weighed down by the need to become someone else. But to reach that place, we must dare to face the truth that part of our life may be built on expectations that do not belong to us. I once thought doubting my own life was a sign of weakness. But now I understand it is only a reminder that something important is asking to be seen. A small but steady echo calling me to look back and ask whether I have sacrificed too much for approval. And this realization did not come like a sudden burst of light, but like the faint edge of dawn, slow, quiet, but certain. Perhaps all of us have stood at the boundary between what is familiar and what is true, a moment when we feel pulled in two directions, one toward the predictable path that earns praise, and the other toward an uncertain road, filled with risk but awakening something deep within. And at that crossroads, we know our life is about to change, even if only through one small decision. That part of me, though still tangled in hesitation, has begun to shift, as if a door long closed is now slightly open, not wide, but enough for the light to slip in. And once the light touches us, we can never return to the darkness the way we once did. One afternoon, I walked along an old street where the trees on both sides leaned their shadows across the road like long arms, trying to hold the last light of the day. Each step echoed softly on the concrete, and I felt as if I were walking between two worlds, one familiar with safe choices and one wide open but full of uncertainty that I had always avoided. That street was nothing special, but that afternoon, it felt like an invisible boundary. I kept walking, and with every step I remembered how, for so many years, I had lived for the eyes of others more than for the rhythm of my own heart. I stopped in front of a small shop with a weathered wooden sign. Inside, the owner was arranging handmade ceramic pieces. His hands moved slowly and carefully, as if each vase were a piece of memory he was gently touching. I did not know who he was, but the calm in every movement felt like a quiet answer. Some people have found a way to live with themselves, no matter what the world thinks. I stood watching him for a long time and realized how deeply I longed for something that simple. But that longing did not come only from inspiration. It came from years of exhaustion, tired of pretending to be fine, tired of always worrying whether my actions would disappoint someone, tired of choosing what I should instead of what I wanted. That kind of tiredness does not rush in like a storm. It sinks in day after day, like fine rain falling endlessly on a roof, rotting the wood before we notice. And when we finally look back, the strongest parts of us have already been worn down. I once tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that everyone goes through it, that if I kept going, everything would fall into place. But the truth is, there are things that only trap us deeper the more we insist on them. And the deeper we sink, the harder it becomes to see where we end and where the mask shaped by others' expectations begins. One quiet night, I opened the window. The wind rushed and carrying the scent of dry leaves and the cold rising from the street where the lamps had just been lit. I stood still for a long time, listening to the sound of distant cars fading down the hill. In that moment, I saw clearly something I had always avoided. I was not afraid of change. I was afraid of being judged for changing. I was not afraid of taking a different path. I was afraid of standing alone on that path. That realization made my heart tighten and open at the same time, like an old door gently pushed by the wind. And when that small beam of light slipped in, I began to wonder if the limits I believed in were only stories I had repeated too many times, if the feeling of not being allowed was something I had built out of old fears. Maybe it was time to step back from the noise and listen to my own voice, even if that voice was still fragile. Then I thought of the people who once told me they felt stuck, confused, as if they were living a life written by someone else. Those faces, those confessions, made me realize I was not alone. Perhaps you, the one listening to this story, have also stood inside that feeling. If something in this story touches you, if you have ever lived through days where you felt you were breathing to someone else's rhythm, I think you will understand what is rising in me now. And if you want, leave a small thought, a simple word, so I know that on this journey of finding ourselves, we are not walking alone. When night fell, I sat at the doorstep and watched the road ahead fade under patches of soft yellow light. Everything became so quiet that I could hear the leaves brushing against each other outside. In that stillness, I understood that some truths appear only when we have the courage to be silent. And what I saw most clearly was that living by the expectations of others does not only take away our freedom, it also makes us strangers to our own true feelings. That sense of distance does not come from a lack of love, but from a lack of honesty with ourselves. When we know what we want, but choose the opposite, our soul splits into two parts, one pushing forward for the sake of safety, the other calling us back home. And that feeling of being torn is what leaves so many people exhausted without knowing why. I want to tell you about another image. Once, I saw a girl standing in front of a bookshelf in the library. Her hand brushed the spine of an old book, but she pulled away, as if the book represented a choice she did not dare to take. She looked around, then walked away, carrying that hesitation in the slight curve of her shoulders. No one was watching her. No one cared which book she chose. But I knew she did not choose, because she was thinking about imagined eyes she had created in her mind. I understood that because I had done the same. We do not only carry the expectations of others, we also carry the fear that we will not be accepted if we do something that does not fit the version people are used to. And that fear is what makes us step back from the things that once lit up our heart. I sat in the dark for a long time that night and realized that change does not begin with a grand decision. It begins with a small but clear recognition. We deserve a more honest life. We deserve to breathe without holding ourselves tight. We deserve to look in the mirror and see someone living by their own choices. As that awareness became clearer, it did not push me to act right away, but it loosened the invisible strings that had tied me for so many years. I do not know how I will move forward, how I will change, or whether I will be brave enough to continue. But I know one thing for sure. I can no longer return to the old version of myself. Once we see the truth, we cannot pretend we have not seen it. And when that small door in the heart opens even slightly, the real journey begins. If the first part is realizing we are stuck, then this part is learning to take the first steps toward a path that belongs to us, even if it is still blurry, still distant, and filled with many unknowns that lie ahead. I began to feel the quiet movements inside myself more clearly on the days that seemed the most ordinary. One morning I woke up, looked at the pale gray sky outside the window, and realized I no longer wanted to put on the familiar coat of someone who always does the right thing in the eyes of others. Of course, I still wore it. Old habits do not slip off our shoulders overnight, but the moment I pulled the zipper up, I realized I was wearing it out of fear, not out of choice. And simply recognizing that made me breathe a little differently. There was a time I sat in my small kitchen, listening to the sound of water running from the faucet while the warm yellow light fell across the wooden table. It was the familiar space I saw every day. Yet that day, everything looked so still that I could clearly see the tiredness lingering at the corners of my eyes. I asked myself why we try so hard to please others, even when it makes us stray from who we are. Maybe because we were taught that harmony matters more than honesty, that safety matters more than freedom. And when we repeat those beliefs long enough, they become an invisible wall standing between us and what we truly want. I once told a friend that I felt like I was living inside a box someone had placed around me long ago. The box was beautifully decorated with compliments, recognition, and temporary smiles that made me believe they were warm. But no matter how beautiful it was still a box. My friend looked at me for a long moment and asked, "If you know it is a box, why not step out?" That question made me fall silent because the answer was simple yet hard to admit. I was afraid of the emptiness outside. The box, though confining, was familiar, and the outside was wide, cold, and offered no guarantee that I would not lose my way. But in the days I tried to understand myself more, I realized there was something even more frightening than stepping out of the box. Living my whole life inside it. A life safe on the surface, but empty on the inside, until I no longer knew who I was. And when that thought came, it felt like a small crack running across the familiar wall inside me. Only a small crack, but enough for light to slip through. I started noticing the moments when I compromised, like when someone asked me for help with something I did not want to do, yet I nodded because I was afraid they would think I was difficult. Or when I chose a path everyone labeled the best, even though it drained me. Or when I sat at my desk each morning, not because I loved what I did, but because I feared the way people would look at me if I chose something different. Each time, I told myself I was doing the right thing. But what is right? And right for whom? One evening on my way home, I saw a small boy standing in the grass, trying to reach a kite tangled in a tree branch. He stretched his arm, stood on his toes, then looked around as if searching for help. But in the end, instead of waiting, he picked up a long stick, tried a few more times, and the kite finally dropped to the ground. He grabbed it and ran off with a smile so bright it seemed to warm the whole street. I stood still, thinking that what made him happy was not just getting the kite back, but the fact that he did it on his own. Some joys are so real and simple that we forget we once had them inside us. Watching that boy, I understood something I had always overlooked. Every time we live against ourselves, we take away moments like that. Moments when we know we are living in alignment with what we believe. And it is those moments, not the praise of others, that nourish us. But saying it is easy, stepping forward is hard. Because to live true to ourselves, we must accept that not everyone will understand. Not everyone will support us. We must be ready for uncomfortable looks, for questions that shake our certainty, for comments that might soften our resolve. And most of all, we must be willing to let go of things that once felt familiar, even relationships we thought would never change. I remembered a conversation with a family member when I said I wanted to try a new direction. They did not scold or strongly disagree. They only looked at me with worried eyes and asked if I was sure, if I had thought about the consequences. But it was exactly that look that made me hesitate most. It was a look of love, but also a look that could keep me inside my old limits. And I understood that if I kept living just to keep others from worrying, I would never discover who I could become. Some people believe love means keeping someone safe in what they think is best. But sometimes, love means letting them walk on their own, even when their path is not the one we hoped for. I learned that by looking into the fear in the eyes of the people who cared for me, and realizing that their fear reflected my own. But if I kept stopping because of that fear, neither they nor I would ever see the real version of me. And then, in a quiet moment, I asked myself a simple question. Can I accept disappointing someone if that is the price of living honestly? That question was not easy to answer. But as I sat by the window watching the long trails of yellow lights on the street, I knew that some disappointments others will forget. But disappointment in ourselves stays. When I realized that, I understood that to live true, we must be willing to trade things that seem small but weigh heavily on the heart: approval, expectations, temporary praise. In return, we gain something lasting: integrity with ourselves. And once we find that integrity again, it becomes a small flame bright enough to light the first steps of a new path. It is not rebellion. It is not defiance. It is a return to what once made our heart come alive, to the purest desires, to the voice we abandoned. And when we return, we no longer try to become the version others want. We simply try to become the person we know we can be. There are nights when I lie still on my familiar bed, staring at the ceiling blurred by the warm yellow glow of the bedside lamp, and realize something I used to avoid. Most of the choices in my life did not come from freedom, but from the fear of what others would think. Realizing this did not bring a sense of release. It felt more like opening a door to a room where old memories had been waiting in silence to be faced. And when I stepped into that room, I understood that to live true to myself, I had to be willing to revisit the things that shaped me long before I knew how to question them. I remembered my childhood, when every praise or scolding carried the same message: you are good when you please others. A child who hears that often enough learns to tie their worth to external approval. And I carried that habit into adulthood like a shadow that refused to leave. I did not dare do what I wanted if it risked disappointing someone. I did not dare say what I believed if it might offend someone. I did not dare turn in a new direction because the old path, though confining, felt more familiar than the open space ahead. That habit made me forget something simple. Every choice carries a cost, and when we choose safety, sometimes the cost is ourselves. One gloomy afternoon, I sat by the window looking down a narrow alley where trees shifted gently in the wind. Yellow leaves fell, swirling a few times before touching the ground. I suddenly thought that people are like those leaves, born with a natural shape, but then carried by winds they did not choose. We call those winds circumstances, responsibilities, expectations. But sometimes they are only old paths we never found the courage to step away from. I began to spend more time identifying the invisible influences I had carried without noticing. The instructions of my parents, the repeated standards of those around me, the fears passed down from one generation to another. All of them blended into a map I followed for years, believing it was right, when in reality, it was only familiar. I realized that some choices I thought were mine were simply the habits built from years of learning to be accepted. One afternoon I sat in a library, where soft light fell through the glass, onto the old shelves. I picked up a random book, flipped a few pages, then set it down without reading. Not because the content was difficult, but because a question was echoing inside me. How many of my decisions have come from my true desires, and how many from unconscious obedience? That question reminded me of the times I took the simplest path, because someone once said it should be that way. Of the moments I hid my differences to blend in, and I understood that if I did not see these influences clearly, I would keep walking in a circle that looked like progress, but was only repetition. It is not that anyone intentionally tried to confine us. Parents, friends, society, they all act according to what they believe is best. But what seems best to them can become a limit to us. The difficult part is not recognizing this, but accepting that we may want a completely different path. And that difference does not make us lesser. It makes us real. I once talked to an old friend about changing her career. She had always wanted creative work, but chose stability. Because my parents will be sad if I miss this opportunity. When I asked what made her hesitate most, she did not mention money or time or risk. She simply said, "I am afraid my parents will be disappointed." In her eyes, I saw not only worry but something familiar. The split between what she wanted and what she believed she had to do. And I understood that such fear can lead someone down the wrong path for an entire life. I asked her, "If your parents would not be sad, what would you choose?" She stayed quiet for a long time, then whispered, "I would choose myself." That answer stayed with me. Because perhaps in each of us, there is a part like hers, the part that wants to live for itself but is held back by love, by fear of hurting others, by the belief that our choices might be misunderstood. But what I have come to realize is this: true love does not require us to lose ourselves. Love does not come from living according to someone else's wishes. It comes from being strong enough to live according to what gives our life meaning. If they love us, they will understand eventually. And if they do not, living true is the only way they can truly see who we are. During those days, I began trying small things for myself. Not big decisions that overturn everything at once, but tiny moments. Saying no to a request I could not take on, choosing a place that made me feel peaceful instead of the place others preferred, giving an evening to something I loved without feeling guilty. Small as they were, they created a different feeling, as if I were slowly reclaiming a bit of space in my own life. I realized that change is not the destruction of everything old. It is asking questions of the things we once believed were right. Right according to whom? Right for what purpose? Right for which version of myself? And each time the answer brought me back to what I truly desired, I knew I was stepping closer to the life I had long forgotten. There was something quiet but clear in that process. No one can take the first step for us. No one knows us better than we do. And no matter how much the outside world has shaped us, in the end, we are the only ones who can open the door to our true life. When I understood that, I felt myself standing at a familiar crossroads that now looked brighter, not because the path had become easier, but because I could begin to see the small light shining through the cracks of my old beliefs. And sometimes, a little light is enough for us to keep walking, even when the path ahead is long and full of unknowns. As I began going deeper into the journey of finding myself again, I realized something that seemed small, but shaped every breath I took. The chains that bind us are not outside. They live inside the voices we hear in our minds every day. Those voices carry the sound of the past, of fear, of memories of rejection, of the moments we tried to blend into the crowd so no one would see us too clearly. They whisper that we need approval, that we should be cautious, that we must stay within the safety circle drawn by generations before us. And those voices make us confuse our true worth with the worth built from pleasing others. There were nights when I sat by the window, listening to the slow sound of cars in the distance, feeling as if my heart were being pulled in opposite directions. One direction told me I needed to do the reasonable things, the expected things, the things that made me look proper. The other direction was a faint call, so small it was often drowned out, but as persistent as the sound of water dripping in the sink late at night, the voice of who I really am. That voice did not promise anything or paint a bright future. It only said, "Listen." And when I began to listen, the first thing I noticed was how much I had relied on approval. Even the smallest silence from someone else was enough to make me uneasy. A message left unread, a compliment that did not arrive when I hoped, a slight change in someone's expression, all of those small things became mirrors, reflecting the fragility of the self I had built from the eyes of others. I wondered why a bit of silence from someone else could shake me so much. Then I understood. When we place our sense of worth on someone else's shoulders, their silence becomes our collapse. I remembered walking in a park on a warm weekend noon. Children ran under the trees, laughter filling the air. I saw a little boy sitting on the grass with a drawing pen, sketching a bird landing on the ground. When his mother approached and asked with surprise, "Why don't you draw something nicer?" he squinted up at her and answered softly, "Because I like this." She laughed and walked away. The boy did not waver. He kept drawing as if the world had never demanded him to please anyone. I stood there for a long time. What moved me was not the drawing, but the innocent honesty of his answer. A simple sentence that would take me years to learn how to say. Sometimes I ask myself what caused me to lose that natural truthfulness. Why do we grow up and forget that we once knew exactly what we liked? What made our hearts beat faster? What made us feel alive? Looking back at the years that passed, I realized that the fear of being separated from the group had grown so deep that it made us believe we would be abandoned if we were not accepted. But the truth is simpler. People are not left behind when they live true. They only move away from places that no longer fit who they are. And that distance, though painful at first, is the only way to find where we truly belong. I started giving more time to silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of connection. Nights without opening my phone or playing music. Just sitting in a dark room with a small lamp shining on a blank notebook. I wrote things I had never dared to admit. Vague desires. Old wounds that had scarred for years but never healed. And something strange happened. The more I wrote, the clearer I could hear my own voice. No more fear. No more old expectations. Only a very small, very real sound from the deepest part of me. In those quiet hours, I understood that living for others turns us into faded versions of ourselves. We become more careful, more silent, dimmer with each passing day. But when we dare to face that emptiness, we realize it is not an enemy. It is the space we must cross to find our way back to who we are. Someone once told me that loneliness is the most frightening thing. But I think the most frightening thing is standing in a crowd and still feeling like you are not really there. It is being in a relationship while hiding what you truly think. It is going to work every day while your heart is somewhere else. It is smiling knowing that smile does not belong to you. And the painful part is that we grow so used to that emptiness that we begin to think it is normal. Realizing this helped me see that stillness can sometimes be a gift. It gives us the courage to stand alone. And in that standing alone, we learn who we are when no one is watching. That is the first step to letting go of the need for approval and becoming our own shelter. One evening, I sat on cold stone steps and looked at the houses across the street lit from within. Each window held a different life, a different story, a different worry. And suddenly I understood that no one has enough time to pay attention to all our decisions. People are busy with their own stories. The judgment we fear most often exists only in our minds. What we think are other people's eyes are often only the shadows of our own fears. When I finally looked straight at that truth, I felt a little lighter. Not much, but enough to know I was starting to loosen the knots, one by one. With each knot released, a piece of myself returned. In the quiet of the night, I knew this journey was still long. But I also understood that I had gone farther than I realized. I was no longer the person who kept my head down following the same old path. I had started to look up, even just a little, toward a road I had never dared to choose. And that looking up, that honest gaze at what I truly wanted, was the first shift that told me I was changing for real. There are mornings when I wake up and feel as if I am standing on the middle of an old wooden bridge. Behind me are years of living according to expectations, and ahead of me is a space that has not yet taken shape. The wind brushes across my face, making the bridge tremble slightly, and in that moment I understand something. Moving forward or turning back both require courage. But moving forward is the only act that can take us to the place our hearts have been quietly calling for all along. I once thought that to change a life, we needed a big event, a clear sign, a moment of sudden awakening. But change comes from the quietest shifts, from the first refusal we dare to say, from the first evening we sit with ourselves without pretending to be strong, from the moment we stop searching for approving eyes and begin asking, is this truly right for me? Those small things gather and push us toward a light we once feared to look at directly. One day, while walking along a lakeside path, I saw the surface of the water as still as a mirror. The sky reflected perfectly on the lake, so perfectly it was hard to tell what was real and what was only a reflection. I stood there for a long time and realized the same thing happens inside each of us. We carry reflections of expectations, of fears, of the ideas of who we think we must become. They blend with one another until we cannot tell which voice belongs to us. Only when we step closer and look deeper do we begin to see the real water beneath all those layers. I realized that to live truthfully, we must relearn something that seems simple: listening to ourselves, not listening to the things we were taught as children, not listening to all those you should, you must not, but listening to the tiny whispers inside, the primal desires, the things that make the heart tighten, the old dreams buried under the dust of years of compromise. One evening, with light rain falling, I sat in a small cafe on the corner. The yellow light blurred across the wet tiles of the floor. I remember opening my notebook and writing the question I had avoided for many years. If no one were disappointed, how would I live? The question sank into me like a drop of ink spreading on paper. A long time later, I added, and if someone is disappointed, would I still dare to live that way? The second question made my hand pause, as if someone had touched a wound that had never healed. But that question opened something I had never admitted. To be free, we must accept the cost of not pleasing everyone. No one can satisfy everyone. And if we try, we trade away our presence, our real voice, our true feelings, our true self. I once feared that living honestly would make me lose important relationships. But when I began to express myself more clearly, something different happened. The relationships built on expectations began to fall away, and the ones built on sincerity became stronger. It turns out that when we live true, we do not only find ourselves, we find the people who truly belong in our world. Once I told a family member that I wanted to change my path. They looked at me, hesitant, then said, "As long as you do not do something foolish." I smiled, because people often call things they have never tried foolish. But when I left that house, I knew one thing. I could not keep living according to someone else's fears. I had to learn how to stand steady in my own uncertainty. And that uncertainty, instead of being an enemy, became the only thing that could help me grow. One evening I stood on a balcony, looking at the lights of the distant apartments. Each window held a different life, a different story, a different dream, a different wound. I realized that in all those countless lives, no one knows what they truly need better than they do. No one can live the choices we must make through our own tears and courage. No one can lead us out of the dark if we do not first dare to open our eyes. In that moment, I remembered a sentence I once read, a sentence like a key unlocking a door inside me. You are the only person who can decide who you become. Perhaps the journey of living true is not about becoming confident, but about learning to stay honest even when we are trembling. Not about being fearless, but about stepping forward even when we are afraid. Not about avoiding mistakes, but about accepting the weight of choices that truly belong to us. I understood that the hardest part is not changing our life, but facing the part of ourselves we abandoned. The part hidden behind praise meant to soothe us, advice meant to protect us, reminders meant to keep us on the common path. But the deeper I went inside, the clearer I heard that voice. The voice I once thought was lost. It is small, but steady. It does not command. It only suggests. It does not demand. It only opens a door. And every time I hear it, I know I am standing closer to the life meant for me. Then one morning, when the sun rose golden like honey spilling across the rooftops, I understood that this journey has no fixed destination. No one becomes true by making a single choice. It is a sequence of small choices repeated through the years. It is asking ourselves each day, today, am I being honest with myself? Some days, the answer will be yes. Some days, it will be no. But as long as we dare to ask, we are no longer lost in a life written by someone else. When I looked into the mirror that morning, the wind gently moving the curtain, I saw myself differently. Not different in a strange way, but different in a returning way. As if after years of walking in wide circles, I had finally found the door leading back to myself. a door that had never really disappeared. And I knew from that moment on, I would never return to the old version of myself. Because after all the loops, the fears, the compromises, the long inner battles, I had understood something every heart needs to know early in life. A life only truly begins when we dare to live it for ourselves. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.